We are closing in on the end of our journey to the cross. Each week we've studied events in the life of Christ, and I've tried in some ways to present a fuller picture of Jesus. And I focused a little more on the humanity of Jesus for a reason. We sometimes forget that Jesus walked the earth, that he was us. He was human and God at the same time. And a lot of times we focus on, well, he was resurrected, he did miracles, and we focus on all those parts. But Jesus also had emotions. He had feelings. He went through the same things that we go through when we go through life. And that's why I felt it was important to focus a little more on the human aspect of Jesus and his time on earth. And one of the things that we do recognize in the life of Christ is that he cried. Now, at this point in our story, we've almost entered Jerusalem on those final days. Jesus is on foot. He's walking slowly toward the city. And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it. Well, men don't cry. Big girls don't cry. It is a great song. You've heard it. You may have even heard your dad say, or you may have said it, or I may have said it, only babies cry. Don't be a wimp. A real man doesn't cry. But science tells us that crying is natural. It is something humans are meant to do. But our culture for years has defined men as the breadwinners, the ones who stand strong and fight the dragons, and they don't show any weakness at all. And crying is a sign that you are weak. Well, I'm happy to say that times have changed. I'm happy to say that my dad never told me to close down the waterworks and not to cry. Maybe that's because my dad cried a lot. It would have been pretty hypocritical of my father to tell me not to cry when I saw him crying plenty of times. I never thought of my dad as weak or wimpy because he cried. My dad cried when we succeeded at something, when there was a special event, when we were honored. He cried at different things that involved us as children. But I never saw it as weakness. As a child, I didn't look at my father and think, oh, he's weak because he's crying. I saw it as a sign that he loved us. There are big problems when we bottle up those tears. Science tells us that repressed emotions lead to negative health changes. There are actually physiological changes in our bodies when we don't cry and when we hold it in. Without a physical release of some kind, repressed emotions can lead to high blood pressure, heart disease, and stress-related problems. And guess what? I have very low blood pressure, which means I cry a lot. There is still a part of me that tries to bottle it up inside, though. But sometimes it is impossible. If you've ever seen the movie Hachi, A Dog's Tale, has anybody ever, I think that's how you pronounce it, Hachi, A Dog's Tale. It's actually based on a true story of a dog that kept returning to the same spot even after his owner died. That was very hard to get through as a guy, and most of my guy friends who have seen it have advised other guy friends not to see it if you don't want to end up in tears. Now for the women, I suppose The Notebook is probably a perfect example of a real tearjerker at the end of that movie. It got me a little bit too. But for me, the movie that really did me in was a movie called Letters to God. We watched it as a family back in 2010, and the movie is based on a true story. An 8-year-old boy is dying of cancer, and every day he writes letters to God that are in reality his prayers in written form. But he sends these letters to different people. He sends them to people that don't know God. For instance, his postman, who is an alcoholic, the mailman is an alcoholic, and he sends these letters to the mailman. And through the power of these letters, people start coming to know God. The postman accepts Christ into his life. And even though we all knew what the end of the movie was going to be because it's based on a true story, it isn't a spoiler to say that the boy does die. We cried, all of us, our whole family. We were weeping. I mean, this was terrible. It was a hiccup-inducing, gut-wrenching, totally incapacitating time of tears and anguish. We all lost it, every single one of it. I'm not sure my kids knew what they were crying for, but because they saw their parents crying, we all cried. It was almost impossible to get through. So there was a study published in the journal Psychology of Men and Masculinity. By the way, I don't know how to get a subscription if you want it, but I suspect there's some of you who probably want to read that journal. I didn't even know there was a journal like that. But Psychology of Men and Masculinity, and they did a study. And the study discovered that football players who cried reported higher levels of self-esteem. Why? Because they didn't care what others thought. They didn't care about peer pressure. I'll give you an example of how times have changed. It used to be that when a player was hurt, they would never allow themselves to be seen crying. You see them with a towel thrown over their head. They would do anything to avoid the crowd seeing that they're crying. Things have changed. Back then, their leg could be, sticking out of their leg. I mean, they could have a compound fracture, and they would not allow people to see them cry, when anybody else would obviously be wailing and gnashing their teeth at that point. But these days, things have changed. Things have changed dramatically. So dramatically that we saw this back just a couple of years ago. No Sean Moreno, who completely lost it. And I'm pretty sure he had a faucet attached to his eyes at that point, based on how much. And that was during the national anthem. And he was asked after this happened, why did he cry, and why did he cry so much? And he said, the emotion always gets to me. I'm just thinking about everything in general. I'm thinking about all the things going on in my life. And it just sort of balled up into one. And it actually helps me. Sometimes I don't even notice it's happening. It just comes. But it helps me. As I said, times have changed. Now don't get me wrong. There are times that we need to hold it in. Women and men who work as paramedics, police and soldiers, there's a lot of people who can't cry. They have to be strong in crisis situations. And part of their job is to remain emotionally steady. Parents can't always cry when they want to. We have to keep our cool and be strong for our children. And sometimes that does mean keeping our feelings under wrap. And children, just because Dawson looked at you the wrong way doesn't mean you're allowed to cry. And Daniel, you can't cry just because Sophia colored in your coloring book. I'm sorry. There is a time and a place for crying. There is a time and a place for weeping, and weeping doesn't mean weakling. The Bible is really quite forward-thinking when it comes to crying. From Genesis to Revelation, we read about men and women crying. It isn't hidden. It isn't a secret. And most of our biblical heroes are described as crying at one time or another. Here are just a few. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him. And they wept, Esau and his brother, weeping. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David, one of the big heroes of the Bible. While Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and casting himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel, for the people wept bitterly. My tears, again the words of David, my tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? I love that little phrase, my tears have been my food day and night. What a description. These are just a few of the many accounts in the Bible of men and women weeping. And they all have something in common. They show the effects of deep emotion spilling out. They reveal true feelings, and there seems to be no attempt to hide these feelings. They weep openly. Many are described as weeping in public. Well, next Sunday is Palm Sunday, when Jesus entered Jerusalem to the cheers of the people. But today, Jesus again is outside the gates. He had yet to enter, but his heart is heavy. Why? It shouldn't have been that way. He had spoken to cheering crowds. Many people were following him. They hung on his every word, but the praise of Jesus came from people outside of Jerusalem. The crowds, the cheering, the joy, it all came from those who witnessed the saving power of Christ outside of Jerusalem. But Jesus was perfectly well aware that the power structure of Jerusalem would reject him. It wasn't just the Roman authorities who wanted him stopped. It was the people who supposedly shared his faith. Jesus was a Jew. And the leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership, they sacrificed their beliefs for power. And therefore, Jesus was a threat to their power. They rejected Jesus. They saw Jesus as a danger to the power structure. And so Jesus begins the final steps of his journey to the cross. And Jerusalem was his destination. And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it. saying, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation. And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it. He wept over the city of Jerusalem. Did Jesus weep because he knew the city would reject him? Did he weep because he knew he was going to die? I'd weep if I knew I was walking into a city and I knew that death was the final destination. I'd cry. I'd run away. But Jesus wasn't crying for himself. The verses that follow make that very clear. He wept for the stubborn blindness of the city. He loved a city that had no love for him. Can you imagine? On the doorstep of death, Jesus cared about those who hated him. Jesus cared about those who were going to kill him. When Noshan Moreno cried and said, I'm just thinking about everything in general through my whole life, all balled up into one. Isn't that what Jesus was doing? The reality of the situation came down on him, and the depth of feeling overwhelmed him. It was a good, gut-wrenching cry. When I read those few words, Jesus wept over Jerusalem, I realized how much Jesus cares for us. Because if Jesus could cry over those who were going to kill him, how much more does his heart feel for us? There's a story told of a woman who went to her pastor and she said, I've been a believer for 20 years. I've memorized scripture. I've taken courses on how to lead people to God, but nothing has worked. I can't win anybody to God. I don't understand what the problem is. What is going on? The pastor looked at her for a moment and said, the reason you haven't led anyone to God is because your eyes are dry. She looked at the pastor, my eyes are dry. And then he explained, you have failed not because you don't know enough, but because you don't love enough. When you truly love someone's soul, you will care enough to weep for them. That night, the lady went home and began to read the Bible. She dropped to the floor and prayed on her knees with a broken heart. As she prayed, she could almost feel her heart physically change. It was filled with a depth of emotion she had never felt before. And then the tears began to well up inside of her, and she wept. She began to think of all the people in her life who needed to know God. And as she stood to her feet, she cried. She remembered her sister who lived close by, who didn't know Christ, and she drove to her house. Her sister was completely shocked when she opened the door and saw the tears rolling down her sister's face. Through her tears, she spoke, more than anything in this world, I want you to know what it means to be a believer. That night, seeing the care of her sister, she became a believer. She became a Christ follower. That's the depth of emotion that Jesus has for each of us. The picture Luke paints is of a heartbroken Jesus. For 3 years, he's been preaching the good news. He has been healing the sick. He's been casting out demons. He's been teaching people to love their enemies. Miracle after miracle, healing after healing, teaching after teaching. And still the city does not see the truth. What will it take to convince Jerusalem of the truth? Surely his death on the cross will do it. Surely in that action they will be convinced of his overwhelming and all-consuming love. It's why he cries. It's why he's heartbroken. Sadly, Jesus knows that even his own death will not convince everyone. In fact, he knows that some of his own will deny him. They will deny that they ever knew him. Even his resurrection won't be enough. And still he cries. He's more concerned about the lost than he is about his own life. How do we convince our friends and neighbors that Jesus is the answer? It starts by what's going on inside of us. And whether we like it or not, what is inside of us will show through. If we truly care, people will see in us what it is that we care about when we cry. Our biblical heroes cried and cried openly. It was a sign of true character, something that we miss a lot in this world. And in this world we have plenty of examples of those who claim to be believers, and yet their actions demonstrate something entirely different. This week you may have seen the news of a preacher who wanted his congregation to pay for a $65 million plane so that he could travel from church to church. Now, I will say this. The pastor this referred to is a man who is actually in charge of he's pastor of several churches across the country. So having a plane does make sense, but a $65 million plane? And I struggle sometimes as to whether I will say something that sounds judgmental toward another pastor. So I decided I'm not going to say it. Kirk Franklin, who sings that song that we all like, Revolution, whoa, that song. Kirk Franklin is also an author. He's a speaker. I didn't do a very good job of that, did I? Anyway, not even close. He's a speaker, he's a musician, he's a songwriter, so much more. He has been hugely successful. But despite his success, he is a living testimony of what it means to live out your faith on a day-to-day basis. And he wrote an amazing article this past week called The High Cost of Character. And in that article, he says what I would say if I was able to say it, but I think he expresses it so much better than I could ever say it. He says, we don't have a shortage of greatness. We have a shortage of character. When a pastor wants people to buy him a private plane while a missionary in Somalia bathes children with sores, that's a shortage of character. When I camouflage my greeds to look like needs, that's a shortage of character. When young students are comfortable enough to sing racial slurs on a bus while furthering their education to someday lead a corporation that may have minorities apply for jobs, that's a shortage of character. And it's something you can't teach in school. To all of those legends who are closet stars, to the ones that stand in awe of how they made it and you didn't, spread the word. Reach back and tell the youngins, shout it from the White House to Wall Street. What's killing our country, what's killing our churches, what's killing our children is a lack of character. And it costs what it costs. Broken hearts. Jesus wept over people who didn't even like him. Jesus wept over people who were going to kill him. The only way things change is when our hearts are broken. Jesus' heart was broken. When we see Jesus cry and realize that he's crying for us, and we also need to cry for the world. When our hearts are broken, Jesus will make them new. He will wash them whiter than snow. There is something cleansing about a good cry. What happened after we watched that movie, Letters to God, and we were all in tears? We started looking at each other. We realized that we totally lost control, and we began to laugh. And it was one of those gut-wrenching, awesome laughs that you can have where it's out of control. Just giggling, laughing, just totally losing it. There was such a feeling of being washed clean, even in that moment. That's what a good cry does. There have been a few times in my life when I've completely lost it and wept. And when I'm done weeping, it's cathartic. It cleanses. It helps focus. I can imagine Jesus weeping, closing his eyes, and then standing up and taking the first of his last steps. He was a man standing whose heart was broken, but it was also clean. When we come to that point, only then will we truly make a difference in the world. Only then will we truly be able to reach people in the world.